Welcome to another episode of the Old Turtles podcast, a show about entrepreneurship, AI, and what HBO is going to do once the last episode of Game of Thrones is over with this week. Joking, of course, the answer to that is nothing. They're not going to do anything. They're probably going to go out of business, but we'll all have to soldier on anyway. I'm Phil Libben, CEO of Old Turtles, and I'm filling in today for John because he's busy, and I guess I'm not. So I'll be hosting this episode. Today, I interviewed Gabe Campodonico and Kelly Chen, who helped make Sift. Sift is our news therapy app, because I think the news is literally making us all sick. And Gabe and Chris Plogue and I have been thinking about this idea for a while. It was actually the very first idea. It was the genesis of Old Turtles, and we finally released it, and Kelly has been a great addition to the team. So we'll talk to them about what news therapy is all about, and in particular, they came up with a really interesting experimental way to release this product, which I think is we've learned a lot from, and hopefully will be of benefit to other people thinking about releasing products. So we chat about the problems that the product is solving and the intersection of technology and journalism and the incentives that make the news feel so sick today. Then Jessica and I dispense random advice to entrepreneurs, this time about money, which is an important topic. And here's the thing about advice. I guess this is an intro, but I'm actually dropping some content right in this intro. Here's the thing about advice. When you get advice from someone, they're never telling you what they actually did. They're telling you what they wish they would have done. Which is why a lot of good advice is true. It rings true because the people giving it to you wish they have actually followed it, but they never did. Anyway, and then we take listener questions about our name, why we're called Old Turtles. If you already know that part, just skip the ending. Hope you enjoy this episode. So from Sift, we have Gabe and Kelly here today. Welcome, guys.
Hi.
Hey, thanks for having us.
So what is Sift? Give us a quick overview.
So Sift is an app where you can get background information about the really tough topics that we're dealing with in today's news. It goes through an overview of history most of the time. It's also got a lot of the underlying data and information that can help people kind of feel more grounded and better understand these contentious issues that are out in the world.
Why'd you choose to work on this?
Well, it was probably back, mid-2016. There was an election going on. There was quite a bit of debate swirling around about a lot of issues. Immigration would be a good example of one of them. And the coverage of it was so often very surface level. And it was fairly frustrating to actually try to go and find good information about what really was behind these topics. So we thought there should be a way to provide that for people so we can have a better debate about these things.
So I think some of our listeners have kind of heard me talk about Sift before, and they're going to know that you and I, Gabe, and Chris, and a few other people have been kind of thinking about this for a while. But Kelly, how did you get involved, and kind of what made you interested in this as a mission?
Yeah, so before Sift, I was at CNN. I was at Huffington Post, the Center for Investigative Reporting. So I come from a pretty hard news background where most often I was the one assigning breaking news stories and making sure it's accurate and out there in the world as quickly as possible. So all of those breaking news alerts that you get on your phone in the moment that happens, that's usually my responsibility. And to come from that sort of urgency to something like Sift, where we're really taking a step back and kind of slowing down the pace of how you not only get news, but consume news, was really fascinating with me. And mostly because with Sift, we have an opportunity to really put like the news consumer first. You know, our team really prioritizes that, which is not often the case with traditional newsrooms because there are just so many other responsibilities that you're supposed to be dealing with. And so having this opportunity to really think about how people are going to react to the news and how they're going to have an appetite for it was really something that was fascinating for me.
When do you think the news started making us sick? When did this start to happen? Like I remember 20 years ago or something, it wasn't anything like this vibe, but like something seems to have changed to where news is really just meant to antagonize people and keep them in a heightened state.
Yeah, it's interesting because I come from a different sort of probably perspective that like news hasn't, it may feel like news is so much more heightened now. And that's partly because of the way we deliver things on platforms such as television news, cable news, social media. All of these different platforms are optimized for certain things. But I think ultimately the way we produce news and what we deem as newsworthy hasn't changed that dramatically.
Right.
One of our tracks we go into, one of our topics is media literacy. And we really go into the history of how news as an industry came about. And so we kind of unpack some of these assumptions on objectivity, on trust, and figure out like where that power lies and who's the one really producing that information. So kind of making people think a little bit about where their news is coming from. That part hasn't changed.
Do you think, Gabe, that maybe the news hasn't changed that much, but the way that we experience it, the way that we perceive it has changed and gotten worse?
I think so. I mean, Kelly mentioned cable news. Part of that phenomenon is the idea of a 24-hour news cycle. Right. So if you have to fill that much time with something that is meant to at least seem important, while it's maybe kind of the same stuff, it's coming at you in this kind of constant stream versus, at one time you would wake up in the morning, you would look at the newspaper, and that was your news for the day. Whereas now it's, if you go online, it's up to the second, up to the minute.
I think maybe even kind of sharper than that, like if you have to produce a half hour or 1 hour, news show, local news, or even like what network news used to be like, you got to produce an hour of news. All of the economics are basically, you just want people tuning in for that hour, but you're not trying to get them to stick around forever. And so you're going to pack that hour with whatever's going to be useful, kind of get people interested. I think, as soon as it became 24 hours, like it's not like CNN could have afforded to have 24 times as much stuff. Like they couldn't afford 24x the expenses of making the news, but they needed to have people watching it. Like if you only watch CNN for an hour, they wouldn't commercially be successful. So all of a sudden it became like, how do you keep people hooked? How do you keep people watching somebody talk about the same exact thing for hours at a time? And that just became engagement philosophy, which I think directly led to social media, which then made it 100 times worse because Facebook, Twitter, they really want you to, if you're only using it for a half hour, that's not enough. They need you to keep doing it. So all of this dark science of keeping people in a heightened state of anxiety to keep them clicking and engaging and watching is something that, I don't know, probably started with 24-hour cable news and then just mushroom cloud exploded on social media.
Right. And the sophistication and the tools social media has to do that is kind of taking it to that next level where, they're building algorithms that are specifically tuned to keep you coming back, keep you looking at things and spending as much time as possible.
So how do we push back on that? What are the things that are forcing the cable news networks and the social media to do this thing, which is pretty harmful, and how do we avoid those things and push back a little bit?
I think part of it starts with media literacy and understanding where you, as a news consumer, what your role is. A lot of times when we feel like I'm being bombarded with news, breaking news, polarized news, left out of that equation is you as a news consumer. You have access, you have power in what you're reading and how you're interacting with it and what you choose to buy and purchase. So I think to combat this sort of sense of helplessness is really kind of putting that power and agency back into the hands of the news consumer. I think throughout the last few years, especially with social media and technology and different platforms kind of incentivizing the wrong things, it's really difficult to remember that news consumers have power to change the way things are produced.
The other side of that is also kind of the business model, right? Where are the incentives? So most media right now is driven by advertising, which is all about getting as much, as many eyeballs as possible. We are looking at other ways. We want to sell what we do directly to our readers.
And I think a lot of the industry is moving towards that direction with different membership models, subscription models. And now we're kind of at a place where we're going to see if the audience is really going to put their money where their mouth is. They say they want something a little bit more in depth, more thoughtful, less harmful. this equation needs to work with like everybody in it.
I think the problem isn't even just advertising. I think the problem very specifically is cheap advertising, targeted advertising. I think it's when advertising was like a full page ad in, Life magazine. That was a very expensive thing. But everyone who looked at Life magazine, which is a pretty broad spectrum of the population, would see the exact same ad. You kind of had to like make the advertising something that would convince a lot of different people to try your product. Whereas now with advertising being so micro-targeted and so cheap, it's really about like, what is the sharpest thing that you can say to this individual person for very, very, very little incremental expense? But that means that the only businesses that can survive to do that are the platforms that have continuous, constant engagement. So it's like death by a million tiny little messages that are meant to antagonize you. So we came up with this concept, right, of news therapy, which is what we're calling Sift. And it's kind of an experimental idea. And so you guys took an experimental approach to rolling it out. Talk about that. The kind of the experimental approach and the rollout, the test that we did back in the fall on a single topic, and what were we actually trying to experiment with, what we were trying to learn, and how did it go?
Sure, yeah. I mean, that's really where it started. We kind of had three questions that we wanted to get answered. We wanted to, we had this idea of news therapy. We wanted to know if the things we were doing to support that would actually work. So our first question was, does this work? Another question is, are people interested in it? Will they read it? And the third question is, will people pay for it? And as soon as we had those questions, you start thinking about, okay, what kind of study can we do? How can we get answers to these questions? And we fairly quickly came to the conclusion the best way to do that is just to get this out in front of as many people as possible. So rather than kind of running more traditional studies, we put together kind of a very contained experience. So it was one topic. We bookended it with some questions to help understand how people were feeling before and after reading this topic. And we released that into the App Store where we could get kind of direct feedback from real users. And we ran that for about 2 months and got really great feedback and really a great volume of information to help us understand what the next steps might be.
So what were the quantitative results in that, kind of the highlight numbers?
The questions about how will this work were about anxiety. So how anxious do you feel before and after? We're about feeling overwhelmed. That's another big problem people have with the news. It's just so much information, they feel overwhelmed by it. So we wanted to kind of test how people felt before and after for that as well. And the numbers came back around, a 30% improvement for those things before and after, which were actually kind of above and beyond what we were looking for. We were looking for getting something around 20%. So those results were quite good.
Mm-hmm. And I would also add that our users' curiosity spiked as well after going through our topic and Sift. So it's really coming back to our idea of how do you stay informed without feeling overwhelmed, but also feeling kind of grounded and empowered to kind of go about your day without feeling so helpless.
So people use Sift and then feel more in control, feel less anxious and more curious about the news topics. Do you expect Sift to replace how you consume the news?
Absolutely not. The news is there for a reason, right? Like our, whenever there's a breaking news event, whenever there's a tragedy or like a fire or an earthquake, where do you go? You turn to the news. Like they are the ones to give you up to the minute accurate information.
You don't expect people to turn to Sift for their news.
No.
I think we very much see it as something supplemental. So you will use Sift to better understand the news you're reading. We're not reporting on breaking news at all.
Better understand it, but also just experience it in a healthier way.
For sure.
Almost like build up the resilience to be able to deal with the onslaught of news that you normally get in a healthier way with a healthier response.
Yeah. Right. And our topics are designed to use data and interactives in a way where we're allowing users to kind of pause before they read something or before they, consume a sort of fact that kind of challenges assumptions a little bit. So it's like at what year, they're kind of like little quizzes where you have to like use a little bit more of your brain to kind of engage that learning experience.
So when we first started thinking about this, we thought that there'd be a pretty heavy AI component in this, and then kind of decided, nope, there's actually no need to have any AI in here. And so now this is a purely manual process. Can you describe what is the process for writing and editing and researching this?
Yeah, so it's a long and ongoing process. For our first series, we've decided to tackle 6 very big, hefty topics. That includes immigration, climate change, media literacy, guns, healthcare, as well as education. And with each of these topics, we have worked with several editors and journalists and researchers, some data editors, to kind of figure out what is the best way to kind of surface a lot of the nuance within these big contentious topics. And so that process takes a lot of time. Like, we can't use AI or some sort of aggregation to surface that kind of nuance. So it really takes all of us as a team effort collectively to think, okay, here's all the information. How do we present this in a way that is most accessible to our users? And that process is very collaborative, a lot of revisions, a lot of editing, and we somehow end up with a topic.
Part of the challenge is always going to be what topics should we cover. So part of that criteria has to do with, we're trying to talk about things that are difficult, are contentious, are the things that are being debated. We want those things to be things that have a healthy debate around them, things that have good faith arguments, multiple good faith arguments. So that is part of the criteria that goes into it.
Right, and that's interesting because that's something that feels like it's sorely missing from a lot of cable news and internet news. Are the good faith arguments. You tend to, because no one's really trying to convince anyone of anything. They're just trying to rile people up. So you just don't get exposed to the good faith arguments on the other side. You get exposed to the arguments that are supposed to make you feel righteously angry on your side, and then the othering or demonization of anyone who disagrees with you.
Absolutely. And I think one of the other things that happen is that when you do, they use evidence and data quite a bit in the news because it's an important part of it. But until you actually start digging into these things, what you won't realize is there's always nuance. There's always caveat. Statistics get thrown out all the time as kind of absolute proof of something. One thing we try to do is say, based on this data, based on these numbers, this is a reasonable conclusion. But always include those caveats. What are other ways to interpret it? What are the other angles? Which isn't necessarily a good way to kind of convince something of a thing. But if what your goal is to actually help people understand the complexity of a thing, then that can be really powerful, I think.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's where we are so different from the news, where when we produce news, we need a good headline, a good, very tight body copy. If it's a TV package or whatever, here with Sift, we have the time to kind of explore those nuances and complexity. And our kind of takeaway isn't a hot take on, you should have X, Y, and Z opinion on immigration. It's be okay with the complexity of it. Be okay with the nuance and the discomfort, that there are pros and cons, and then figure out where you fall in there somewhere.
Yeah, and kind of be okay that there are people who disagree with you that have good faith arguments. And it's the rest of the internet seems to have been set up to obscure that so that it feels like you're constantly battling these monsters. And that's stressful if that's literally what you feel like. So who's working on this? What's the team look like?
So we have kind of 2 big main buckets of work that we have to do. It's an app, so we have to build that. There's a experience that has to be wrapped around this, which is maybe a little bit different than typical publishing. So there's kind of the design and engineering team. And then on the other side, there's the editorial team that actually has to develop and build all of this content. So Kelly, you can...
Yeah, so one of the really unique things about our editorial team is that we do work with very traditional reporters and journalists and researchers who are experts in their field, including Lewis Wallace, who is doing our media literacy piece on objectivity and bias in the news, as well as working with editors who come from multiple disciplines, not just a news background. We work with editors who come from a poetry and translation and literature background, and that level of just nuance and thinking about something differently from that approach has been really helpful in creating something that should be supplemental to news instead of something that replaces news.
So now this has been out for a few weeks now. So what kind of feedback have we gotten?
It's been good.
I mean, feel free to start with the death threats.
Yeah, we're still only at one. So
only one death threat.
We're still at a grand total of one.
Oh, all right.
So that's good. I think we'll see how it goes from here. Otherwise, it's been.
I'm not asking for more death threats, internet, please.
Yeah.
You really don't need to,
we're
send us more. We're good. One is okay.
Yeah. Otherwise, I think the feedback we have gotten continues to tell us that this is something that's sorely needed. Sometimes you're creating a new thing and it's very difficult to explain to people what it is, and they kind of look at you like, I'm not quite sure if this is something anyone's going to want or use. But with Sift, as soon as you kind of get halfway into the explanation of it, or as soon as someone uses it, they very quickly say, "Oh yes, this is something that's sorely needed." The people who have used it certainly have been great.
Yeah, my personal experience in showing this to people have been the comments and the feedbacks are kind of exactly as you said. They're generally very positive, and they're generally like, "Oh yeah, I really need this." But we are on the internet, so there's a lot of criticism as well.
Mm-hmm.
Kelly, what are the things that people are criticizing Sift for?
So if you look at our App Store reviews, we get really great 5 4-star reviews, and then it's like a bunch of 1-2-star reviews. So on the App Store, we're basically like Yelp. People like us, but they hate our service or something like that. So it's fascinating because I feel like folks who somehow find us but don't quite understand what we're doing kind of just want to feel their opinions and arguments kind of reinforced in that echo chamber.
People get really used to that, right? It's like there's a lot of people who that is their perception of all media is you go there to feel this fuzziness of being reinforced. And
when we don't offer that to them, they get really upset.
And we're not trying to challenge people. We're just trying to say we're not here to make an echo chamber. Right.
We're very much about, consider different opinions and consider different approaches, consider different frameworks. And if people are not, there and open to that consideration, we're not necessarily going to be able to change your mind, or that's not our goal at all.
Right. I think it's, it's one of the core challenges we have. There's being totally unbiased is more of an idea than anything that actually exists in the world. And I think perception of bias is kind of more about where you're coming from than what any, one media outlet is actually about. And these things change over time. So we're actually not trying to promote ourselves as being unbiased. But I think people pick up on this idea that this is something that's intentionally trying to be maybe less biased. And as soon as they see something that's like, no, I completely disagree with that, then they perceive bias essentially.
Right. It feels like what you're trying to do is not be necessarily less biased, but less inflammatory.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And exactly. we want to make our arguments and our information accessible. So if people do disagree, they can go directly to the sources, directly to the primary material and, dig deeper for themselves.
And then, of course, we don't have an Android version yet, so...
Or an iPad version.
Yeah, a lot of hate about that. But those are hopefully coming.
I think that's a sign of success when people are asking for the Android version, then you're onto something.
Yeah, exactly. This soup is terrible, and there's not enough of it. Yeah. So how do people get Sift, as long as they have an iPhone?
For now? Yes, you need an iPhone. Yeah. No Android version yet. But you can go onto the App Store, search for Sift News Therapy, and you can download the app.
Great. Thanks, Kelly and Gabe. It's been really rewarding seeing you guys work on this and being a part of it. I hope we continue to have enough success to justify an Android version.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, thanks, Phil.
Yeah, thank you.
Now it's time for Advice to Entrepreneurs segment. What is it? Advice at entrepreneurs?
Whether they want it or not.
Yeah. Unsolicited advice for entrepreneurs.
Or just advising at you.
I got some meta advice before we get to the actual advice.
Oh, God.
Meta advice is about advice, which is when someone gives you advice, they're not actually telling you what they did. They're telling you what they wish they had done. Mm-hmm. So it's almost never right. Easy to ignore. Says more about the person giving the advice and what they didn't accomplish than anything that you should do.
I think it's kind of useful to hear about people's failures, even if they're not super self-aware about them.
True. On that note, some actual advice. This is about money. In particular, I get a lot of questions about what kind of money to fund your company is better. You need money to do stuff to fund your business.
Sadly, yes.
And you can get it from investors, you can get it from revenue, you can get it from debt, you can get it by, cutting expenses. Like at some point, it's all the same, right? It's just
I love
dollars.
that you say it like you have a choice. You could get it from investors or you get it from revenue.
Yeah.
Obviously, I think most people would opt to get money from revenue.
Well, see, aha. That's the question, right? Is like there is this assumption that like money from revenue is better than money from investors.
It's true.
But is it?
Well, that's not Silicon Valley's assumption. Silicon Valley's assumption is that money from investors, at least for a while, is better than money from revenue.
And we all know Silicon Valley is always right.
Oh, damn it.
But I think it's a good question. And when you think about it like this, like I think the misconception about money from revenue being better than money from investors is you assume that money from revenue is somehow free because like you don't have to give anything away. Because if you get money from investors, you're giving something away. You're being diluted, right? You're giving away ownership. But if you just sell a product and you have revenue, you're not giving anything away.
Except your lifeblood.
Right, exactly. Except your lifeblood, which in many cases is like worth a lot more than your equity. And so the way they think to think about money, and like you're in a position now with Spot where you have this exact trade-off, right? You're booking revenue, like you're getting revenue.
Mm-hmm.
But you could also go and raise money from investors.
Right.
And this is a trade-off that's like very topical. And I think for a lot of companies it is.
Yep.
And in many cases, you really are better off taking money from investors than from revenue if you can get investors that are cheaper in terms of your time and effort and lifeblood than early customers.
Mm-hmm.
But if you can't, then the opposite is true. So like there's nothing magic about one type or the other. I don't think one type is necessarily better than the other. But depending on who you can get revenue from and what kind of revenue it is and who you can get investment from and what kind of investors they are,
yeah,
it could very well be that investors are better than revenue or vice versa.
I mean, I think with early customers in particular, if you're still sort of fumbling towards product market fit, it's really, really easy to let early customers sort of steer the direction of the product.
Exactly.
And so that is a case in which I think you really want money from investors, right? So that you have the autonomy to determine the product that you're building and where it fits into the marketplace rather than your early customers who might want to use it for this one particular use case, but also have a vested interest in you expanding to sort of other use cases that you're not interested in.
Right. You may be solving that particular customer's problem and you may be compelled to do it if they're paying you, but that may not be a problem that you're actually interested in solving in general. And it could cost you months or years. And then that's much more expensive than getting money from investors.
Yeah, it's really easy when people who are not investors are willing to pay you. It's really easy to like want to do whatever it is that they ask.
Yeah, I think that's right. Which I think, we should do an eye roll please segment at some point on, the customer's always right. Which is,
I mean, it's just, you're just so like delighted that someone wants to use your product and pay you for it that it's really hard to say no or sniff it, to turn your nose up at like customer suggestions.
But often it's the right thing to do. So I think in terms of money, think about it as the cost of money. Like no money is free. It all comes with a cost, and sometimes that cost is dilution of your equity. And sometimes the cost is a massive amount of wasted time or effort. And sometimes the cost is being forced to do something that you don't like doing or don't want to do. All of those have a cost. And just try to compare your options and don't fool yourself into thinking that any one of them is free. They all cost something. Whichever money costs you the least is the best money for the occasion.
Is there a specific kind of money that you're more attracted to right now?
Well, at All Turtles, at this point, we're just at the point where we're getting some significant revenue. So for the first few years, we had almost no revenue. We did a pretty traditional thing where we were getting money from investors. But that was intentional because we wanted to build out a kind of a machine to make products before we actually started making the products. But even just saying from investors, there's many types of investors. And that's a whole other giant segment about the difference between VCs and banks and strategic investors and all of that stuff. But right now we're getting to a point where I think for products that we are confident have good product market fit, like the one you're leading, like Spot, then we should have money from customers because this is the product we want to sell. So we have to worry less now about, being forced to make the product that we don't want to do. had we tried getting money for Spot from customers a year ago, I think it would have been a very different kind of product.
Yeah. And even now, right? Customers have a lot of suggestions, you might say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think we should, I don't know if we've done segments about how to properly ignore customer feedback, but that's a good one to do. I feel like there's a whole curmudgeon-y, podcast series that we can do about how everything you've been told about customers is wrong.
And here's where I have to come in and say how much I love Spot's early customers because they're so invested and they're so on the right side of history. So yeah, I like our customers.
So maybe that's really the way to wrap it up is if you have an opportunity to get money from investors, you should take money from investors so that you can have the right first customers that you're aligned with, that you love.
Yeah.
An investor's job is to get you the altitude that you need to kind of get to the right customer so you can avoid the wrong customers really early on.
Sure. Yeah.
Now it's time for a listener question. This one comes in from Michael via Twitter. Michael asks, is All Turtles a reference to the probably apocryphal Bertrand Russell story, quote, "It's turtles all the way down"?
I love probably apocryphal.
Probably apocryphal.
As some people in this building would say, that's the name of our next band.
Yeah, I played bass for probably apocryphal
right.
in college.
But yes, correct.
Yes, good job, Michael. Very few people actually get that reference. Almost nobody correctly attributes it to probably apocryphal Bertrand Russell.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, but the Bertrand Russell story is really it probably didn't happen, or it probably happened in a way that was much different than how it is recounted. But it's really an accounting of the Aristotelian metaphysical concept of the prime mover, right? So this one major force in the universe that kind of creates the entire world. And it's a historical view of the creation of the world rather than the prime mover view of the creation of the world. And the reason that we're interested in that is because we believe that, the idea of this sort of the myth of the founder in their garage, kind of creating something out of nothing with absolutely no village around them or not leaning on anyone is, bullshit. And that most people are standing on the shoulders of the people who came before them. And there are very few things that have ever been created that really just involved one person in a turtleneck in their garage.
Yeah, I think we want to be this platform of platforms. Exactly. Standing on the shoulders of the people before us, supporting the people that come after us. And it's turtles all the way down for us. Thanks, Michael, for the question. If you have a question also, you can tweet us at allturtlesco on the Twitter machine, or send us an email to hello@all-turtles.com. This podcast is a production of the All Turtles Worldwide Media Empire. We recorded this episode in the world-class Donatello Studios in San Francisco, California. Thanks to Kelly and Gabe for joining us in this episode. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions, or anything else you want to talk about, send us an email to hello@all-turtles.com. Marie reads every message. Thanks to everyone who made this episode possible, including Jim Metzendorf for editing, Marie McCoy-Thompson for producing, Chris Plogue for his audio expertise, Mike Rivera and Carlos Rocafort, fourth of his name, for our artwork, and Matt Ammerman for our theme music. On behalf of Jessica Collier, John Cifuentes, yours truly, Phil Libin, and the rest of the All Turtles team, thanks for listening.